I will be presenting today onto God Unknown, and the model that I'm going to give for my presentation is kind of a model that I want you guys to kind of go on. So it will. So I think the person who will, I think Abram's the first to present. He's not with us yet. Maybe he will come in a second. But basically, what I want you to do each time is want you to start by giving me a little bit of literary as well as historical context for what is happening with the novel we're reading that week. Um, and you'll see exactly in a moment how I do that for this one. I want you guys to give me some biographical context. So, like what was going on in Steinbeck's life during the time the novel was written. I want you to list what you think are some key themes in the novel. So, of course, whenever we're talking about themes, theme is the central, sort of the main central ideas within the novel, right? So, like the big ideas, like the nature of good and evil, right? Stuff of that big, like those big sort of themes. And then I want you guys to come up with some key passages in the novel that we will look at as a class because literary study is nothing if you don't look at the text, right? So you have to always look at the text and you'll end discussion questions. So after you give your presentation, that's kind of like when you turn the floor over to the class and we'll kind of go off the discussion questions that you have provided. So usually as far as going through the material, I'd like to see you go about 10 or 15 minutes. Okay. So I have a very high, by the time you talk about all this content, it'll be easy to talk that long. I will talk a lot longer than that because I will probably uh, wax poetic on some of the stuff. But that's my expectation for you guys is about 10 to 15 minutes. And then once you turn the floor over for discussion, we'll use discussion questions. And I'll help you out then, right? I'll kind of help steer the conversation along. But we'll use your discussion questions as a model. And before we get started as well, I also wanted to mention that I have been working very closely with Lissa Clark in the library, and she has between Lissa and between both the librarians, they have worked with me in getting together a lot of good materials. So one of the things that show you guys, I'm at my house right now, but they have a Steinbeck biography. They have most of the good Steinbeck biographies. It's in the other room. They have most of the good Steinbeck biographies there. And the way that you get them, you have to go inside the library and ask one of the librarians, and all the Steinbeck stuff in there is under the course reserves. So there's a couple of biographies in there. Jackson Benson's John Steinbeck Writer. That book was written in the early '80s, but it's still the definitive biography on Steinbeck. Yeah, but there's a couple of other ones as well. Susan Schillinglaw's book about John and Carol Steinbeck. Carol was his first wife. That book's very relevant to these first couple of weeks because up until the Grapes of Wrath, that is when he was married to Carol. And William Souter's new biography on Steinbeck is in there as well. In addition, there's a book in there about Steinbeck's that's got Steinbeck's letters in it, at least the authorized letters that they allowed to be published. So if you ever kind of want to get a glimpse into what Steinbeck was thinking while he was writing some of these novels, um, a lot of those letters that he wrote during the composition of the novels are in there. And as well, when we get to Grapes of Wrath, I don't think any of you guys are presenting on Grapes of Wrath. on both Grapes of Wrath and East of Eden. Kelvin, you're presenting on East of Eden. Um, there's all of his journals that he wrote while he was composing the book. So you can kind of read side by side. As you read through the novel, you can also read his journals on the days that he wrote that section of the novel, which is a pretty cool reading experience. So all that stuff is in there. I made sure that they ordered it all. And whenever you guys do your own presentations, I would especially encourage you to look at the biographies, just especially to give me some context on what was going on in Steinbeck's life at the time he was writing um, that
So,
book.
Mr. Hill,
Yes.
so just to be clear on what you're saying, so whenever we do our presentations for these readings, every Friday or so, you want to know the literacy criticism, what was going on during his life, the themes, and just like a little summary of the story. That's basically what you're looking for in a span of 15 minutes.
Yeah, as well as key passages.
Key
So, like,
passage.
what are some like really key passages we should talk about as a class together, and discussion questions too.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
So you'll see in a second how I do that, and I don't just expect you to do it. I'll give you a model first. Okay.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a class, guys, where you will definitely be going to the library. This is oftentimes we pass over to the library, and it's there for a reason. And I'm going to make sure you guys go into the library a lot this semester and use both Lissa, both the librarians. So Lissa will be here next week. She has also worked with me on putting together a lib guide, and she's still finalizing it. But she will be with us next week to talk about the lib guide while we talk about Of Mice and Men. Okay. So she's been wonderful. She is as much of a resource for this class as I am. Okay, so definitely take advantage of her help. So let's go ahead and get started then, and I will present for you Unto a God Unknown. So anytime that I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me if you have a question or something's unclear. You guys know if you can do that, you know I won't get offended. Let's see. So can you guys see this first slide, an introduction to Steinbeck's novel To a God Unknown?
Yep.
A good deal, good deal. So this is the Penguin Classics version. That's the version I lent you, Kelvin. It's got the night that's got Joseph Wayne's tree on the cover, which I think is a pretty nice touch. But this novel was written in 1933. It wasn't his first novel. Well, I'll go biographical, then I'll go back to literary. But this wasn't Steinbeck's first novel. His first novel was like a. Steinbeck has always had an interest in medieval literature, and his first novel, Cup of Gold, is kind of a medieval story. It's Cup of Gold. Nobody really reads it anymore. Um, it's definitely an aspiring writer's first novel. It's really rare that an author really strikes gold on their first novel. It's got some interesting stuff, but it's not something that even Steinbeck scholars really read anymore. To a God Unknown is really one of his first, what we think of as really good novel. He also, during this time, wrote a group of interconnected short stories called The Pastures of Heaven. And for this class, I decided to focus more on his novels rather than his short fiction. So, but The Pastures of Heaven is certainly worth reading. So, with that said, let me go back a slide. So the literary and historical context for the time. Um, Hunter, Kelvin, have any of you guys taken either the British literature or the American literature with Jamie or Miss Ayersman?
Yes, sir. I took the British literature class with Jamie.
Same man. A
So
lot of reading.
did you guys study the modernist movement in that class? You might have read James Joyce or Virginia Woolf.
I remember Virginia Woolf, yeah.
Yes, sir.
I think he gave me one of her texts. I had to read one of her poems, I think.
Yeah, so you're familiar with this idea then of the modernist movement that started in the I said it started in the 20s, but it really probably started in the late teens. But during this time period, a group of writers that got together, and they saw a lot of the fragmentation that was happening in the world. And just to give you a little idea of what I mean by that, during World War One, there was destruction on such a rampant scale that no one had ever seen in human history. Uh, there was one battle during World War One, especially where more people died in that one battle than died in the entire American Civil War. Just to kind of give you an image of the destruction that happened during that war. I'm not going to go too deep into the history, but basically the destruction happened because there were such advancements in defensive weaponry, and there really wasn't a lot of advancements in offensive weaponry. And you had things like big machine guns, but you still were using Civil War rifles. So you can kind of see how that would start a war of attrition, right? That's when they all kind of dug into their trenches, and the war almost never ended. So lots of there's lots of great intellectuals during this time, but they saw that destruction that happened during the First World War, and it really kind of made them think, like, are we really doing everything right? Right? If this is what society has, if this is what society and culture has led us to, maybe we need to redefine our culture. And so this group of writers that are often called the modernist writers, they set out to create a new literary culture. And it wasn't just a literary movement, it was also a movement in the arts. Um, Lots of artists as well decided to reject this old classical style of art, thinking about like Renaissance art, like Da Vinci and stuff. A lot of these painters as well decided to experiment with form in their art. And lots of them saw a divide between what they call high culture and low culture. High culture is literature that's meant for people of great cultural knowledge, right? Lowbrow culture is stuff that's almost like formulaic. So you guys, this discussion is still going on today. I don't know if you've seen a lot of like Martin Scorsese, the famous film director. He's always like talking trash about Marvel movies, right? He's saying Marvel movies are not true cinema. So this discussion of highbrow versus lowbrow literature is still very much in our discourse today. You think about like what are serious films that come up during Oscar season, what are some not serious films. The Barbie movie didn't win any awards recently, right? Despite the fact it was a really good film, because it was seen as low, right? It wasn't seen as highbrow. And Steinbeck is often seen as more of a lowbrow writer compared to some of these others that I'm going to kind of contextualize them with. But modernist writers wanted to write great literature that rejected the past. So by rejecting the past, they often wanted to create literature with new forms. This is when you started seeing a lot of stream of consciousness style literature. Mm, By stream of consciousness, of course, I mean like oftentimes you would just get thoughts in a character's head, and you would get the narrative coming straight from a character's head. William Faulkner, The Sound of Fury, he actually tells the story through four different characters. And one of them actually is disabled. So you get the story through four different lenses, and you kind of coming up with even like what the plot of the story is almost like coming up with a puzzle. But Steinbeck is really not a writer who practiced experimentation with form in that type of way, like Joyce or Woolf, like you guys read, or or Faulkner, or even Hemingway. He adopts more modernist style themes, and most scholars of Steinbeck kind of trace him to a group of other West Coast style intellectuals. And there's also a really good poet that was writing during his time, Robinson Jeffers. He and Steinbeck have a lot in common as far as like things that they write about. But instead of talking about form, instead of experimenting with form, their forms were conventional, but their themes were modern. Whenever we think about modern themes, we think about things like isolation, right? Um, we think about lots of 19th century philosophy showed up, right? The limits, religion, um, Nietzsche's theory of the Superman, right? I'll talk more about that in a second. Lots of these modern themes Steinbeck wrestles with. So when I mentioned a second ago that Steinbeck had a group of fellow West Coast intellectuals, it wasn't just literary writers. Some of the other intellectuals that he dealt with. We're going to talk a lot about Ed Ricketts over the next couple of weeks. But Ed Ricketts was Steinbeck's best friend, and he was a biologist living in Monterey. Steinbeck lived in Monterey, California, which is about an hour south of San Francisco. But Steinbeck's relationship and friendship with Ed Ricketts, who was a marine biologist, definitely shaped a lot of his thinking, as well as the famous mythologist Joseph Campbell. I have a slide on both of those in a second. But during this time period as well, the Cup of Gold didn't take place in California, right? It took place in the medieval past. This was really Steinbeck's first experiment in writing about his home in Northern California, and pretty much most of Steinbeck's great fiction takes place right in the Salinas Valley in California. And if you guys have never been there, it's one of the most beautiful places on earth. And that's where even a lot of the agricultural output in our country, even today, is done. It's there in the Salinas Valley. There's one town in that area, Gilroy, I think. That's where they grow almost all of the nation's garlic, for instance. So, but yeah, if you drive through that area, like my aunt lives in Fresno, if you drive from Monterey up to Fresno, you just pass by farm after farm after farm, and that's where almost a lot of the nation's agricultural output is done. And this was the area that became the focus of most of Steinbeck's fiction. with a few exceptions. Pretty much everything we're going to read takes place in Northern California, except for The Winter of Our Discontent, which is the last book we'll read. So here's an author who's definitely regional, right? He's regional. He writes about what he knows in his region. And it all started with this book. So they say in a creative writing class, write what you know. Well, that was good advice for Steinbeck, because he wrote about his home and kind of showed how people in his home were almost universal to the human condition. Before I go on, let me stop real quick for questions. You guys feel like my explanation of modernist writers was good? You feel like it aligned with what you knew already? How you Kelvin Hunter? How you feel about that?
Just cool.
You're good.
Yes, sir. I thought it matched up with a lot of the stuff we learned in the other class about it.
Good. Yeah, the something I didn't mention is a lot of these writers that I mentioned, like T.S. Eliot. You might have read The Wasteland in another one of your classes. Fitzgerald, Hemingway. A lot of those writers even rejected America, and they decided to move to Paris in the 1920s. See, hold on a second. We have somebody joining the meeting. There's Avery. Okay. Yeah, but a lot of the writers moved to Paris during this time. That's something that Steinbeck never really was tempted to do. He did go over into Europe during World War II. We'll talk about that later in class. So, talking about some of the influences on his life. So the first we should probably mention is Carol Steinbeck. Carol was his wife right up until the early 1940s. I'd have to look at a date to see when they got divorced, but it was in the early 1940s. Steinbeck wasn't faithful to her. That's why that they got divorced, which is a shame, because she was probably the best wife he ever had. She was a very clear inspiration to his fiction. So she and he were both fellow intellectuals together, and they would often have great conversations about what he was writing about. And Steinbeck actually struggled a lot with grammar. That's something that a lot of people don't know. Carol was the one who helped him. So Steinbeck would often dictate to her what he wanted her to write, and she would be the one to type for him. So you think one of the great novelists in the 20th century, right, struggled with grammar. He did. Carol was great for helping him polish his sentences, especially. For a lot of these early works, she was almost as much of a writer of them as he was. And that sounds like a bold thing to say, and probably some Steinbeck scholars would even disagree with me in saying that. She had a very profound impact on his work. So if you guys take a look at some of the stuff in the library, that biography, John and Carol Steinbeck, Portrait of a Marriage, it goes a lot into their marriage and how much she actually helped influence them. And by the time they got divorced, he still wrote some great stuff, but she definitely had a really significant impact on his thinking. She helped make him more empathetic, which his empathy became very central later to some of his great fiction, like The Grapes of Wrath. So his wife Carol, monumental influence on him. Ed Ricketts, we'll talk a lot about him in the coming weeks. But next week I'll give you a short story to go along with Of Mice and Men called The Snake. but a lot of his, and we'll also read a novel later in the class called Cannery Row. And Steinbeck actually makes Ed Ricketts into a character in that book, Cannery Row. But Ed had a great interest in nature and the interconnectedness of nature. And his famous work is called Between Pacific Tides. And he certainly had a monumental influence on Steinbeck. This whole novel that we're reading today is about nature. Well, you can guess that all of his conversations with Ed definitely helped pave some of his thinking. But some scholars debate how much he had an influence on this novel, but certainly by the time we get to the Grapes of Wrath and Cannery Row, his influence is huge over those. Then Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist, he wrote a famous book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And that's probably the most famous book in mythology studies. Edith Hamilton's mythology is probably a debate between the two. But Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he traces all hero stories going back to the myth and tries to show how there's one sort of universal hero story. We're basically telling one story over and over and over throughout history and millennia. And the story has different patterns, but Campbell kind of traces the patterns that storytelling has taken. You guys might know of a famous sci-fi series that started in the 1970s, right? Which one am I talking about? You know the one. They got lightsabers, right? Which one is it?
Star Wars then?
Star Wars.
Star Wars, right? George Lucas actually read this book, Hero with a Thousand Faces, and that gave him an inspiration to write the narrative in Star Wars. So there's interviews with George Lucas where he flat out comes out and says that. I wouldn't have come up with Star Wars if it wasn't for reading this book. So on your light reading, right, during the summer, pick it up. You should pick this book up. It's a great book. But this book has a lot of themes dealing with mythology and especially like heroism, Christ-like behavior even. Steinbeck's conversations with Joseph Campbell had a lot to do with some of these themes that we have going on in this book. And you can actually look up Joseph Campbell on YouTube as well. He would, during close to the end of his life, he was a very prolific speaker. You should look him up later on your own time. He was I might post some of the videos on our Moodle page for us. He was certainly a great thinker. His influence is probably only during the early 30s because he and Steinbeck had a falling out. Campbell actually made a pass on Carroll, and that kind of ruined their friendship, as you could imagine. But Campbell's certainly a great thinker, so I would encourage you guys to look at his work sometime. You could teach a whole class just on this book. I actually had a class in undergrad where all we did was read this book. So but it definitely changes the way you think about fiction if you ever read it. So that's some context out of the way. So now my short summary of the novel. So this is very much trying to the plot of this novel is kind of all over the place. But my summary that I wrote myself: Joseph Wayne decides to move to California as little exists for him back east. Upon arriving, Joseph grows attached to the land. He finds a tree on his property and he believes that the spirit of his father passed into the tree. He also discovers a glade with a rock that sits at the center. Joseph speculates that this place is a holy one where nature joins together. He meets Elizabeth, and even though his personality is strange to her, she feels compelled to marry him. The land thrives, and Joseph's brothers move their families to California with him. Joseph's strange behavior to the tree horrifies his brother Burton, who decides to kill it. The land dies. Elizabeth falls on the rock in the glade, which kills her. Joseph decides to stay on the dying land rather than go off with his brothers. By the novel's end, he commits suicide as an offering to the land. The rain finally comes and the land is whole once more. So again, the plot of this one's a little all over the place, but that's the basic gist of it. I left out a few characters there, especially Joseph's brothers, but trying to capture the whole plot in one slide, I think I did it okay. So let's talk about some key themes, and I'll kind of walk you through a lot of these themes that are going on in the novel. So when I told you guys whenever I want you to do your own presentations, I want you to think a lot about theme. We'll start with this modern. I won't go in the order. I want to start with modernist isolation, since that's the one that I was talking about a second ago. Joseph Wayne in the novel is very much an isolated sort of character. And Abram, I want to call on you because you actually wrote about this in your journal post for today about how isolated and almost inhuman Joseph is with his emotions. Right? You want to talk about that?
I don't know what I can say about it really. He's I just get this feeling that he's more of a loner type of person, and not as a personal choice. It's just who he is. And that's how he and I can't remember his name. His best friend.
Juanito.
Yes, Juanito. I feel like that's kind of how they became best friends, because it explained how he was really in tune with nature, and I get the same feeling from just from him, like they just from each other. I get that they're both really, I don't know how to explain, just loner and like to be one at peace with nature, I guess.
Yeah, contrast him with his brothers, right? His brothers
Right.
keyed in, right?
Can I add something to that?
Sure, Kel, go ahead.
When I was reading it, like towards the beginning a little bit, there was a moment where I think in his home with his brothers and his father, he felt like he was, departed from the family. Like he didn't feel like he was one of them. So I feel like that's why he, isolated himself and went away, because he didn't feel like he was one whole family with the rest of the family.
Yeah, why do you think that, Kelvin? Why do you feel like he didn't connect well with his brothers?
I by my notes, I believe he just I believe that I think his father just paid more attention to them instead of him. I
Right.
believe, and that's basically what I went off.
Yeah, like he almost didn't feel a connection to his home, right? I think you're taking us there, Kelvin. He didn't feel a connection to his home, both
Yeah,
both with his brothers, and they said that he grew up in Vermont, right? But they say that people grow attached to the piece of land that they grew up on, right? Think about you guys. Some of you might feel more attached to your where you're from than others. Um, I've personally always been a person attached to this area, right? Like I never really wanted to ever move from this area just because I feel a connection to the place. Joseph, maybe with things going on in his family and with just not feeling any attachment to where he grew up, he decided he was going to take off to California, right? So yeah, I think you're spot on there, Kelvin. Yeah, yeah, Abram, you wrote a lot about, especially about how he doesn't really have any good feelings for, like he just doesn't feel things either, right? You wrote a lot about that too.
I feel weird calling anybody, especially a literary character, um, you know, sociopathic or egotistical or anything like that. But it really feels like he has almost no real emotions, and the ones that he does feel, it's either like his embarrassment whenever he's trying to propose it's either really powerful, directed at him toward himself personally, or it's almost non-existent. So that's kind of how I felt about the way he viewed the world.
Yeah, it's very bizarre, isn't it? You know, just how little he feels in that way. He's almost scary.
Right.
He's almost scary. He comes off as very scary, both to Elizabeth and Rama, the two women in her novel. Um, and Hunter, you have anything you want to add on onto this? What did you notice about Joseph's isolation?
I thought that it was interesting that although he felt isolated personally, and you mentioned like Rama and Elizabeth feeling like some sort of fear towards him, they also, Rama mentions in some point, she says that she doesn't love Joseph, but she worships him. I thought that was an interesting piece of the story.
Yeah, that's a strange sentence even to say out loud, right? Like, I don't love him, but I think she tells Elizabeth, you will learn to worship him, right? Which, yeah, this is you're taking us to down a good path, Hunter. So our next point going up the list is the Nietzschean overman. So you guys didn't take philosophy with me. Maybe you will next year, but maybe you've already had it before I started teaching it. But you might have heard of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche has, if you go back and read through his work, I could spend a whole class just talking about him, so I'll try to make it quick. But Nietzsche's really thought that Christianity was a negative influence on Western culture. He thought that that kind of made Western culture weak. It made us too emotional. Whenever you say turn the other cheek, right? That's such a almost an unhuman thing to do. Right? He said Nietzsche thought that Christianity really is part of the reason why Western culture, for a lot of the problems that we have in it. And Nietzsche, what I said by Nietzschean overman, we could also say Superman. But Nietzsche imagined a world where someone would rise up. That person would not be tainted by emotion. that person would almost become superhuman in a way. And in turn, that person would make people rethink ethics. So, in how we live our life, what makes a good life. So, this person would have such a strong aura of personality that it would make you reject the past and accept some type of new ethics. Well, so there's my quick 1 minute spark note version of a very complex philosopher, right? But Nietzsche, during a lot of 20th century literature, you see a lot of writers play with this concept as thinkers who kind of transcend the past and pave a way for a new future through their sheer personality. Well, Joseph, you said it a second ago, Hunter. Joseph definitely kind of fits this archetype, right? They say several times, like, we should. Thomas says, worship them. The father Angelo, close to the end of the novel, compares him to Christ. Right? He said it's a good thing that there's not a lot of communication networks out here, right? Otherwise, we might have a new Christ in the West. Well, what did he mean by that, you might ask? Well, somebody who kind of paves the way for a whole new system of ethics, a whole new way to think about how we should live our lives. So,
well, he said it was like a good thing that he was preaching Christianity. Otherwise, they might find him as the God instead of the Christian God, right? And that was the whole vanity issue he had.
Right. Yeah. That you said it better than I did there, Adrian. I think that. Yeah, it's a good thing he's there to keep preaching, right? Otherwise, they might form a new religion.
Right.
So, yeah, this is the Nietzschean sort of archetype of a Superman in a nutshell. And Steinbeck actually did read Nietzsche. Sometimes when you talk about, like, how did one thinker influence another thinker, you can kind of go down a rabbit hole. One of the interesting things about Steinbeck studies is we actually have a book called Steinbeck's Reading, which shows every book he ever owned and his thoughts on the books. So Nietzsche's famous book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it's actually was part of Steinbeck's library. So we can infer that he was probably familiar with Nietzsche's thought. Organized religion versus mystical thinking. So we're kind of along this line too, right? But there's a big skepticism in the novel towards organized religion. And most of the representatives we get of that is mostly Catholicism and just Protestantism. The father and Juanito are both Catholics, right? Whereas Joseph's brother Burton is a Protestant. But especially Joseph's brother Burton starts to feel weirded out about things that are happening here on the farm with Joseph. He starts seeing that Joseph almost worships the tree that's there on the land, right? And of course, Joseph believes that tree is his father. He feels like his father's spirit went into that tree. Of course, the moment that almost becomes the turning point of the novel is when Burton cuts the tree and then leaves to go preach somewhere. So that's almost a kind of a hateful thing to do, right? To cut the guy's tree. But he kills the tree, and which turns the novel completely around. And Joseph only goes to the father late in the novel because he starts to feel desperation. Right? He asks the father to pray for rain. So Joseph is a person who certainly doesn't need religion, it seems, in the novel, right? Partly because, as Abram said a second ago, you can almost say he's kind of coming up with his own religion in a way. And that's something we can talk about as the class goes on. Pantheism. Pantheism is a fancy word for nature worship. So, but also, of course, the worship of more than one god. So polytheism is the worship of more than one god. Pantheism is nature worship. But it's kind of similar, right? Joseph in the novel pretty much worships nature, right? So he doesn't ever kind of put necessarily a god on nature. He doesn't say, I'm God, you're God, somebody else is God. He kind of sees nature as one whole interconnected sort of one whole interconnected God in and of itself. Nature is God almost in the novel. This is what we call pantheism, nature worship. And just to go up 2 points, deep ecology and the interconnectedness of nature, cycles of life and cycles of the seasons. I don't know if you guys noticed this about the novel, but the whole novel is seasonal in structure, right? It starts in the summer. I think it goes through 2 years, right? It starts in the summer. Well, it starts in the winter when he's in Vermont, but then he gets to California in the summer. Then the whole novel kind of takes place in different seasons. And you can kind of see the seasons of life in the novel, right? The birth of the land, the death of the land, and the winter. Like Steinbeck is really sort of in tune with those types of seasonal structures in the book. The whole book, that's how it's organized. It's beginning to end, right? It's based on the seasons and nature. And let me ask you guys this real quick. I know some of you guys took critical theory. Have any of you guys studied in depth eco-criticism, the study of literature and the environment, literature and nature? Have you guys done a lot of that kind of stuff in your other classes?
I don't remember a whole lot of eco-criticism in critical theory class. There was a lot of just well, not nature, I guess, but a lot of more natural criticism, I guess.
Right, you remember any of the authors that you read, Abram?
Not off the top of my head.
Right. Yeah, I asked because this eco-criticism is probably one of the most popping areas of literary criticism right now. It's really popular in current scholarship. And people who study nature and the environment, literature and the environment together. I think I said on that lecture video I posted last week, since we didn't get to have class, that eco-critics try to look at how we can read literature to better think about nature. How do we think of nature in terms of our dominion over it? Like, are we stewards over nature? Steward naturally means caretaker, right? Are we caretakers? Are we above nature in some
Personally, I'm a fan of the steward's perception. Sorry, I'm back.
You guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. My mic randomly fell on me. You said you said a second ago, Abram, that you like the steward idea. Why is that?
I just I feel not similar, but kind of along the same lines Joseph does, and I'm a big fan of nature and how I feel in nature. So that's where I get that feeling from.
Yeah, that idea comes from classic Judeo-Christianity, even, right? Because at the beginning of Genesis, God tells Adam that he's going to be the steward over nature, the caretaker. Well, that's a pretty lofty responsibility to have, right? Because you don't want to be the caretaker. You don't want to mistreat nature or exploit nature under that definition. So eco-criticism definitely makes us think more about how do we treat nature. Um, Joseph is a person who gets to be obsessed with it and wants to become one with it. So this novel really actually didn't have a lot of good literary criticism on it. The first time I read the novel was probably 2007, 2008 when I was in undergrad. At that time, there was hardly any scholarship on this novel. But over the past 10 or 15 years, this novel has actually become, uh, there's actually been a lot of scholarly articles published on this novel because people who are interested in eco criticism, nature, and the literature and the environment, they see a lot of interesting stuff happening with this book. I'm going to actually show you guys something real quick. I haven't posted it to our Moodle yet. Something I'm trying to do for you guys is compile together articles that might help you later with your research papers. Let's see. Give me a second, I'll pull it up. Here we go. Yeah, so far, let me share the right screen for you. So far, I've did some research on The God Unknown, and I sort of located articles that have come out over the last few years. Let's see. Here we go. So I'll share this stuff with you guys later, but some of the titles of articles that have come out in the past few years. Circles in the Forest, Von Steinbeck and the Deep Ecology, To a God Unknown. This is actually a really good article. I've read this one before. Daniel Rivers, The Land Doesn't Stretch, Fecundity, Agriculture and Settler Visions of California into a God Unknown. This was an article that came out just a little over a year ago. Under Strange and Evil Stars, Ecologies of Pain, and Steinbeck's To a God Unknown. This one actually wasn't published in Steinbeck Review. This one was published in Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, spring 2023. That's the biggest journal dealing with eco-criticism. The Clearing Cycle and the Monterey Metaphysics of Ricketts, Steinbeck, and Campbell. I told you guys earlier about Ricketts and Campbell's influence. Steinbeck's To a God Unknown and Wendell Berry, an eco-critical view. Wendell Berry is a famous nature writer. The World Brain and the Watershed, the spatiality of Steinbeck's environmental vision. All these, notice the dates, 2019, 2017, 2020, 2023, 2022. This one's as far back as 2011. But this novel is popping right now as far as scholarship. So there's actually one of my goals in this class is actually to have you guys produce a good piece of scholarship yourselves. So there's some potential for you guys to come up with an original idea that you might not have thought of, that other people haven't thought of. Because frankly, a lot of people are just writing about this novel for the first time. People are discovering it's a hidden gem that they've missed over. Back to the slides. So we'll demonstrate this in a second, how this ecology stuff works. We'll look at some passages. I should probably also just mention real quick the Western expansion, Manifest Destiny. Right? So if you guys know your history, you know in the 19th century, people migrated west. Right? They saw that life in the East, the economy wasn't that great. Oftentimes you had to work in these like factories and stuff. You really didn't get a connection with the land. So a lot of people said, you know what, the heck with this. We're going to move west. We're going to claim our own piece of land. And it was, of course, the American vision in the 1800s of Manifest Destiny. That we would reach all the way from East Coast to West Coast. It doesn't matter who stands in our way, right? As we know from genocidal practices towards the Native Americans. But this book, as well, is really a lot about Western expansion and the mythology of the West. America probably has come up with the last great mythology in the world, and that is the mythology of the American West. So I think about all these Western movies, John Wayne and Clint Eastwood and stuff. A lot of those are just pure myth, right? So the book as well kind of goes a lot into that, right? It shows you at the very beginning why people decided to move west. And it was during this time that Steinbeck was writing in like the 1920s, 1930s, probably about 20 years before this. That's when it was famously said by Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner was a historian who wrote an essay called The Frontier Thesis. Turner said that America would go through a bit of an identity crisis now, because it used to be people who were disenfranchised could go west and get a new start. And at this point now, we have achieved it. We have moved east to west. So what now? What now for those people who want to get a fresh start? Well, it's a fun thought to think about today, right? As bad as the economy is and stuff today, wouldn't it be nice to just move somewhere and get a fresh start? So they had it good in the 1800s in that way, I guess. So the novel certainly makes us think about that theme too. And I put as well transcendentalism. I don't know if you guys studied Ralph Waldo Emerson or Henry David Thoreau's Walden, maybe your American Lit class. But Steinbeck was definitely influenced a lot by Emerson and Thoreau and those writers in the 1800s that really made nature a priority in their thinking. Walden, of course, is the famous book about Thoreau deciding to live in a cabin right next to Walden Pond. He talks about how he is self-sufficient. He makes his own clothes. He grows his own food. He becomes divorced from society in a way. He becomes self-sufficient. So you can start those thinkers from the 1800s. You can kind of see that type of thinking in this novel as well. That was a long slide about the themes, but the novel certainly makes us think about a lot of the themes, a lot of these big ideas. So whenever you guys do your own presentations, you don't have to wax as poetic about them in as long of a length as I did. But try to think along the terms of these big themes, these big ideas that you see happening in the story. So I have a couple of slides dealing with some key passages that we can look at. Let's take a look. If you guys have your books, pop them open. And I'm using the Library of America version that I recommended you guys get for class. So I'll just tell you, I know some of you guys might be using different versions, so I'll just tell you what chapter it is. One of the most, talking about this stuff with nature, the interconnectedness of nature, things like that, one of the interesting passages in the novel actually takes place in the second chapter. It's on page 180 in mine. It's on about the third page of the chapter. But one of the first descriptions you get in the book is Joseph seeing this cannibal. It's not bear, it's boar. Fix my spelling. He sees this cannibal boar. And what would your first reaction be to seeing a boar eat another boar, right? You'd probably be like, ooh, that's gross, right? That's unnatural. That boar's a cannibal. Cannibalism is wrong. So the book kind of subverts, I like to use this phrase, it kind of subverts your expectations almost from the very beginning. You think to yourself, you see something that gross, you'd be tempted to like kill the boar, right? Just because it's a clearly depraved boar. Well, that's not how Joseph thinks. If you take a look at that passage, it's again about the third page. The paragraph starts. Now the path broke into a broad grassy meadow. I don't know if you guys following me here, but that's where we are. Now the path broke into a broad grassy meadow, in the center of which a colony of live oaks grew into a green island in a lake of lighter green. As Joseph rode toward the trees, he heard an agonized squealing, and turning the grove's shoulder, he came in sight of a huge boar, curved tusks and yellow eyes, and a mane of shaggy red hair. The beast sat on its haunches and tearingly ate the hind quarters of a still squealing little pig. In the distance, a sow and 5 other little pigs bounded away, crying their terror. The boar started eating and set its shoulders when Joseph rode into its line of scent. It snorted and then returned to the dying pig, which still squealed piercingly. Joseph jerked up his horse. His face contracted with anger and his eyes paled until they were almost white. Damn you, he cried. Eat other creatures. Don't eat your own people. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard and aimed between the yellow eyes of the boar. Then the barrel lowered and a firm thumb let down the hammer. Joseph laughed shortly at himself. I'm taking too great power into my hands, he said. Why, he's the father of 50 pigs, and he may be the source of 50 more. The boar wheeled and snorted as Joseph rode on by. So now that I read that passage, let's do a little analysis here of that passage. Like I said, our whole discipline is grounded in passages, right? But what did you guys think of this passage? I'm going to call on you first, Abram, because you talked earlier about being the steward over nature, right? You feel like Joseph's being a steward here?
Okay, so before reading the book, I'd say I'm along the same lines as Joseph is. If I were to come across that same scenario and the boar wasn't attacking me, it's impossible for me to say that it's unnatural for that boar to be doing that, because it's that boar is part of nature, right?
Right.
So he's just trying to survive. That's the way I would feel. After reading the book, I see why he's going through with that. A little bit later, he's talking to one of his brothers, I think it's Burton, about how he would be willing to mount the animal if it would give him more calves. He's just trying to repopulate the land. He's trying to make the land grow and produce, and that's why he wants the boars. Those boars are a good source of renewable meat for him. They're a good source of even though they do destroy the land, they're good at plowing the land for you, for further development. That's just how I felt about it.
I think that's well said. Kelvin, what did you think of that passage? Would you have shot the boar if you came on a boar eating another one?
I'm a little biased because being that I hunt, I'm gonna say yeah, I would have. But Abron, he hit it right on. To be honest, he couldn't say it no better.
So as a hunter, it would be your first instinct to take that boar out, right?
Yeah, because if you don't take it out, I'm gonna take you out for sure.
Hunter, what about you? What did you think of that passage?
I feel like he probably did the right thing, and I feel I probably would have done the same thing, maybe for different reasons, but I'm not too big on killing animals in the first place, and also, if it's not harming me, I don't feel like it's up to me.
Mm-hmm. Is that your main reason? You said you wouldn't. That's a different reason. Just having an aversion to animal harm in general.
Yes, sir.
I don't know if you want to chime in, Dr. Ferguson. If you came up on a boar eating another boar, would you be tempted to shoot it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I kind of agree with what Hunter said. There are complex reasons as to why you might go ahead and do that, and I can see a need to step up and take care of that and kill the boar. Yeah.
Yeah, if you guys think about it, there's lots of animals in nature that are cannibals.
Right.
Alligators and crocodiles, the male ones tend to eat the baby crocodiles and stuff. Cobras eat other snakes. That's their main source of diet. King cobras eat other snakes. So king cobras, they're awful and venomous and scary, right? But they take out a lot of other scary snakes. So nature is strange in that way, right? Things that seem, I guess the point we're making here is things that seem unnatural to us based on our sense of Christian morality, right? Nature often works in a completely different way. So Joseph definitely makes us think differently about it. The very beginnings of the book. So good, you guys all had some good stuff there. Let's take a look at another passage on my slides. So let's see. Share my slides with you again. I'm not used to all the clicking in this app. Okay. One thing I want to ask you guys what you're thinking is, let's take a look at so much of this novel centers on this grove, this pool. So that's where Joseph offers himself as a sacrifice towards the end of the book. But there's this one place that seems to be the center of the earth, almost the center of natural activity, and that's this pool that he finds in the grove in the woods. And chapter 6 is when we're first introduced to that. It's pretty close to the end of chapter 6. If you guys have your own, just a page before the last, if you guys have a different version. And I'm looking at page 207, very top of the page. This is where I'll just kind of skim over some of this. It says they had come to an open glade nearly circular and as flat as a pool. Dark trees grew about it straight as pillars and jealously close together. In the center of the clearing stood a rock as big as a house, mysterious and huge. It seemed to be shaped cunningly and wisely, and yet there was no shape in the memory to match it. Short, heavy green moss covered the rock with soft tile. The edifice was something like an altar that had melted and run down over itself. One side of the rock there was a small black cave fringed with five-fingered ferns, and from the cave a little stream flowed silently across the glade and disappeared into the tangled brush that edged the clearing. Beside the stream a great black bull was lying, his front legs folded under him, a hornless bull with shining black ringlets on his forehead. The three men entered the glade. The bull had been chewing his cud and staring at the green rock. He turned his head and looked at the men with red-rimmed eyes. He snorted, scrambled to his feet, lowered his head at them, and then turning, plunged into the undergrowth and broke a passage free. The men saw the lashing tail from the woman and the long black swinging scrotum, which hung nearly to the knees. Then he disappeared, and they heard him crashing in the brush. Then, just a paragraph or so down. "Be still a moment, Tom," Joseph said languidly. "There's something here. You are afraid of it, but I know it. Somewhere, perhaps in an old dream, I have seen this place, perhaps felt the feeling of this place." He dropped his hands to his sides and whispered, trying the words. "This is holy. This is old. This is ancient and holy." The glade was silent. A buzzard swept across the circular sky low over the treetops. So, first things first on that passage, right? Few writers describe nature better than Steinbeck, right? He paints a picture in your brain better than almost anybody, I think. But what do you, especially since you guys have finished the novel beginning to end, What is so mysterious? What's so strange about this glade? Um, what did you guys just make of that setting, that particular setting that Joseph keeps going back to, which is where he also ends his life?
I mean, I don't know if I caught on to any like foreshadowing in that passage there, um, but the fact that he describes it as it's a holy place, it's scary, but it's holy, it's ancient, it's holy. Um, that was the biggest takeaway from there that I took, was because it's signifying that it's a very important piece of the story, a very important piece of the property, and very important piece to Joseph.
Right. Um, me kind of build on what your comment with another question, even. That's the Socrates in me, right? What do you think is holy about the place? Joseph, any of you guys can build that one, but what is so holy about this place? Do you think?
Because of the tree, right?
This isn't the tree. This is the pond that Joseph keeps going back to. But both of them are the same idea here, Kelvin.
Oh, okay. I thought.
You can take the tree if you want, Kelvin. What do you think is, because when they kill the tree, that's when the land dies, right?
Right. And I was like kind of using that like, as the heart and soul, and I was like trying to bring them together when he was talking about like, I'm trying to put it in the best words I can. Come back to me. And I'll think of it. I'm trying to think of the best words.
You'll think of it in a minute.
Yeah.
Um, Hunter, what about you? What did you think of this? Why is the land holy? Why is this particular place holy? You think?
I thought that it was interesting. I don't have the book with me right now, but he does compare it to like a natural altar at some point in there, right? And I made a comparison. There's a Stephen King movie that it's a book as well that I'm not particularly fond of, but it's called Into the Tall Grass. And there's a movie of it. It's on Netflix. And there's something similar in that. And I tried to do the research to find out if the story inspired that story somehow. Because in that story, they're in like a cornfield and there's like a big rock in the middle of it. That's like a central point to the story. They keep coming back to. They bring like their kids to it. They kill themselves on it. And I was wondering if that was something that inspired the story, but I couldn't find anything saying that it was.
That's that's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, that could be a good paper for you later in the class, Hunter, to talk about the similarities between the two. Um, it's just based on how you explain it, you could probably argue that there's an influence there. I like what you said about it being an altar, right? Elizabeth, later in the novel, that's how she dies, right? She actually falls and cracks her head on the rock, and the blood goes all over the rock. That's definitely it's definitely an altar in that way, right? Think about in the Catholic Church, right? The priest blesses the body and blood of Christ on the altar. So there's definitely some parallels happening there. It's the source of all life, it seems, right? This is the very last place that goes when the land dies. And when Joseph, let's take a look at the last passage since we're on the very when Joseph's death, since we're on this subject. Um, chapter 25, 25, right at the end. the last paragraph of chapter 25. That's where I'm at right now. So the sun lost its brilliance and sheathed itself in thin clouds. Joseph regarded the dying moss and encircled trees. This is gone now. I am all alone. Then a panic fell upon him. Why should I stay in this dead place? Thought of the green canyon over the Puerto Suelo. Now that he was no longer supported by the rock and the stream, he was horribly afraid of the creeping drought. I'll go, he cried suddenly. He picked up a saddle and ran across the glade with it. The horse raised its head and snorted with fear. Joseph lifted the heavy saddle, and as the tapadero struck the horse's side, it reared, plunged away, and broke its tether. The saddle was flung back on Joseph's chest. He stood smiling a little while he watched the horse run out of the glade and away. Now the calm redescended upon him, and his fear was gone. I'll climb up on the rock and sleep a while, he said. He felt a little pain on his wrist and lifted his arm to look. The saddle buckle had cut him. His wrist and palm were bloody. As he looked at the little wound, the calm grew more secure about him, and the aloofness cut him off from the grove and from all the work. Of course, he said, I'll climb up on the rock. He worked his way carefully up its steep sides until at last he lay in the deep, soft moss on the rock's top. When he had rested a few minutes, he took out his knife again and carefully, gently opened the vessels of his wrist. Pain was sharp at first, but in a moment its sharpness dulled. He watched the bright blood cascading over the moss, and he heard the shouting of the wind around the grove. The sky was growing gray. Time passed, and Joseph grew gray too. He lay on his side with his wrist outstretched. He looked down the long black mountain range of his body. Then his body grew huge and light. It rose into the sky, and out of it came the streaking rain. I should have known, he whispered, I am the rain. And yet he looked dully down the mountains of his body where the hills fell to an abyss. Felt the driving rain and heard it whipping down, pattering on the ground. He saw his heels grow dark with moisture. Then a lancing pain shot through the heart of the world. I am the land, he said, and I am the rain. The grass will grow out of me in a little while. The storm thickened and covered the world with darkness and with the rush of waters. So I mentioned earlier about pantheism, right? Nature, worship of nature, right? Joseph says during his moment of suicide, right? I am the rain. He has to spill his blood, like almost in a like Christ-like manner for the nature to be reborn again. Right? So there's lots of strange stuff going on in the passage. When you guys read it, were you kind of taken off? Were you guys taken by shock? Like, oh, like that's where the novel went, right? Or did you guys see it coming? Abram, you mentioned foreshadowing earlier, right? Did you see this coming?
Okay, so when I see foreshadowing, I don't ever see it until after I see the big thing. But no, I didn't see him committing suicide at all. I saw him going out and just. I figured he was probably going to go out and crawl into a hole somewhere and die like most animals do, which is what he did technically. But he just didn't. I didn't see him slitting his wrists at all.
Yeah, when Elizabeth falls and cracks her head on a rock, I kept thinking. I know the first time I read it, I kept thinking to myself, he's probably going to come back. He's probably going to come back here. But it definitely takes you by surprise. Steinbeck always writes, as you guys will see through the whole course, Steinbeck always writes shocking endings. The guy doesn't know how to end on a subtle note. Like, he always shocks you every time he has an ending. Kelvin, what do you think of it? Or this suicide on the rock thing?
I ain't really had too much to say about it for real. I just took it for what it was. You know, he felt like he was lying, and when he passed away, evidence showed that things started to happen. So I was like, hey, he made his point.
Do you think? But let me ask you this, Kelvin. Do you think that there was a connection there with Joseph and the land, or do you think it was just a mere coincidence that it happened to start raining after he did that?
Um, I'm gonna say, I'm gonna say, I'm gonna say, yeah, it was a coincidence. I'm gonna say it was a coincidence. Because on one side, I feel like, he was the reason a lot of stuff was going on. And when, he left, it was like it was finally free. It could do what it want. It could manifest and blossom the way it needed to. But then on the other side, I feel like, I feel like, um, I feel like, it was just part of the, what's the word I'm looking for? The prophecy. Like it was supposed to happen that way. Like he was supposed to go off, do his own thing, and all this was supposed to happen, and then it came to light.
So you're definitely seeing the arguments on both sides there. Yeah, I think you can certainly read it either way. Like maybe it's just irony, right? That it just so happened to start raining right there, right? Maybe he wasn't connected to the land. He certainly thought so. Hunter, I don't know if you want to end this thread with a thought.
I definitely thought that Elizabeth was going to die there because there is foreshadowing on her part of like her having dreams, her saying that like she wants to go back and conquer her fear of it and stuff. But I thought initially he was having a heart attack when he got there and he was like, I felt a pain in my wrist. I figured that is what was going to happen. I didn't think that he was going to kill himself, but I did think that he was going to die there. And I don't know if his death had any connection to making the rain start, but I think it's a happier ending for the story if it somehow did.
Right. All that wasn't for nothing, at least, right? If he did cause the rebirth again. Dr. Ferguson, I know yesterday you told me it'd been some years since you read the novel. Is it all coming back to you now?
It is. It's making me want to reread it. Yeah, thank you so much for telling me today is the day you guys were going to be talking about this, because like I told you, it's definitely always been one of my favorites, and I definitely share your love for Steinbeck.
Yeah. Do you remember your reaction the first time when you read it and that ending?
Well, I just liked the mythical connection between him and the land, and I didn't think it was coincidental that it rained. I wanted to believe what he believed, and it made his death seem more meaningful because it was more of a sacrifice. If it was a coincidence, his death becomes meaningless.
Right.
You see, so I guess I would support that it was not a coincidence, and I don't know. It's interesting how you can look at it multiple ways.
Yeah, I think both sides have their merits. I think I'm with you though. I think that I choose to believe that it had something to do with it.
Right.
It barely rained there in like a year and a half. Then here comes a big monsoon, right? Surely he had something to do with that. Let me just
Did you say that book only took place over the course of like a couple of years?
right.
Oh, that changes everything for me. I swear, reading it, it was going through the years. Like, I thought he was almost old man by the time he slit his wrists.
No, he it just took place over a couple of years, because if you remember, his son, Elizabeth gave birth to a son, and then when the land starts drying up, Joseph actually gives his son over to Rama while the son's still just an infant. So, yeah, just a couple of years. The first year, the land's great. The second year, the land's bad.
I
Yeah,
don't know how to feel about it, I guess. It just changes the whole story for me.
yeah. You can probably think to. I know Hunter was mentioning earlier about the altar imagery. You can think of several biblical examples. Of course, I told you about the altar and the body and blood, but you can even think about like back in Genesis when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on the altar. And of course, God sends the angels down to stop Abraham before he does it. But I could see why it would be easy to think of Joseph as an older man, right? Because there's this Abraham-like imagery happening there.
Don't they compare him to Abraham in the earlier chapters when he first gets there? No, it's is it Thomas has a kid or Burton has a kid, and he says that he feels like Abraham whenever God's promise got fulfilled.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Abraham is mentioned. He's almost going to become like Father Abraham, right? Patriarch over a people. Yeah, lots of mythical, biblical type connections. I just want to show you guys real quick. We're about out of time, but I wanted to show you guys real quick some of the questions that I came up with. I kind of naturally built them all into class already. Not all of them. What themes in the novel stood out to you and why? It's often good to it's kind of good to start in that kind of way, that kind of like broad general way, just to get people talking. The way that I worded this question, I think, is interesting. What do you think of Joseph's character and monomaniacal obsession with the land? Is he a Christ-like figure? Is he a Nietzschean overman, or is he a Captain Ahab? Think about Captain Ahab and his quest to kill Moby Dick. Right? Even if you've never read Moby Dick, you know the gist of the revenge story. I said, this is something we didn't talk about, but nature in the novel was often depicted as feminine, both by Joseph and the narrator, but also the Catholics. So Father Angelo often mentions the Virgin Mary, right? So this is kind of a way that Father Angelo thinks about nature from a feminine perspective too. Thinks about the Virgin Mary and her intercessions over the land. He actually says it'll rain because he prayed to the Virgin Mary. He asked for her intercession to God for it to rain. So if you're going to make the case that Joseph's sacrifice was just a coincidence, you could make that claim, right? That the father's prayers might have had more to do with it than what Joseph did. We talked about animal ethics when we talked about the boar. One last question before I let you guys go. Of course, these two questions we didn't really get to dive too deep into, but one of them is about Elizabeth and Rama, and the other one's about religion. Let's take the Elizabeth and Rama one, because I think that's the more interesting one here. Then I'll let you guys go for the day. What did you think about these two women characters? Like, um, Elizabeth, of course, starts as like the scholarly, teacherly type. She, of course, marries Joseph, never fully gets Joseph, I guess you could say. Rama, of course, Rama is depicted as this like Mother Earth type character, right? She's almost depicted as this symbol of fertility. Right? The novel talks about her bosom, her big hips, and stuff like that. Right? She's depicted in this like matronly type way. Um, do you guys think these were interesting female characters, or do you feel like this was definitely an early attempt at Steinbeck to write women, perhaps poorly? What's your hunch here?
I personally could not understand Rama's character, but as I was reading the novel, I was talking to my wife about it and giving her updates, and she completely understood Rama, and she understood the way she was written. And I was sitting there talking to her like, I don't understand why she would, why she would give herself to Joseph, why she would be afraid, like she would want to take his son and then be afraid to take his son in the same breath, and all this. But my wife, she helped me talk through the character and kind of see where her thought process was, where her reasoning behind everything was. Um, but as far as Elizabeth goes, I felt like she was just the epitome of what somebody in a story like this would be looking for in a wife. You know, a good, um, valuable woman.
I think she definitely helped you think through Rama's character pretty well. Um, I remember the first time I read that, and they have sex right after Elizabeth's death. Even I remember thinking how odd that was, but she's definitely this type of symbol of like a classic fertility type imagery that you see. You go back and look through like ancient cultures, and they're like statues of women and stuff, like ancient Mesopotamia and stuff, like those figures that you often see, those statues, those fertility goddesses, right? That's kind of how Rama is painted um, in the novel. She she can't quite understand Joseph, right? Because Joseph's very masculine, right? Even with the spilling of the blood under the land, right? That's almost even a very masculine imagery if you start to really think about it deeply. And Steinbeck's often accused of not being able to write women well. I think that doesn't. Once you read The Grapes of Wrath, I think he's got women down a lot better. This book doesn't stand up to feminist criticism too well, I don't think, just because a lot of the Elizabeth and Rama both are kind of stereotypical characters. Um, yeah, it talks about how all women can't resist Benji's charms, right? Benji's the lonely drunk brother, right, at the beginning, who seduces all the women in the town, right? So good, you guys got through your first Steinbeck novel. So How you guys feeling about him so far? If you find his prose interesting, this first novel grab you, what do you guys think?
It's cool. Yeah, it's cool.
You feel like he was pretty easy to read, Kelvin?
He's a little different, a little complex. My first time really reading something on this level, you know. So it's definitely a learning curve, but I'm embracing it and getting better.
Good. He's easier than the stuff you're reading in World Lit, at least, right?
Yeah, definitely. Where I lit is, you know,
What about the other two of you guys? How was it for your first Steinbeck novel?
I enjoyed it. At the beginning, I wasn't super invested in the story. Most of the reason that kept me reading throughout like the first couple of chapters is like chapter 2. It doesn't straight up say that he has sex with the ground, but it pretty much says it. It pretty much it paints the picture. So I was very confused by this, and I just wanted some sort of resolution, which you kind of get, but never really mentioned it again. But it was good. I enjoyed it. And as for the women thing, I did think that Elizabeth was written in like a really hyper emotional way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Hunter. He was struggling. That over as the course of years go on, he gets better with writing women. But I think it's partially because of Carol, his wife's influence. Um, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that passage. I should have put that on my key passages sheet. That's definitely a striking image in the second chapter, him humping the land. Abram, you will end us today. What do you think of it as your first Steinbeck read?
So not my first Steinbeck read. I've had a couple other instances with him. I will say he's not my favorite author, not my favorite type of reading, but I do enjoy it a lot more than like John Milton.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not much for the old Renaissance lit.
It was a good read, but man, Paradise. It took so long and so much effort to get through it. Paradise Lost did.
Yeah. I love Paradise Lost. It's definitely a challenging one. Steinbeck's definitely a lot easier than Milton for sure. So the next book you guys will read, Mice and Men. I think you're presenting next week, Abel.
Yes.
Mice and Men's a pretty short novella. It's only about 100 pages. That's probably that and Grapes of Wrath are probably the most famous things he's ever written. Of Mice and Men is often read in high school English curriculums. So, a famous story. And on our Moodle page, I posted old video, the movie that came out right after the book. So if you guys watch it, if you guys read it pretty fast, watch the film I posted too. And I'm also going to have you guys just read one short. No, I think I'll actually save the short story for later. Just read Of Mice and Men. We'll have enough to do just with that. Very good. One last thing. For your reading journals, I'm noticing this with the first couple of submissions that I've looked at so far. But with them, try to anchor yourself in the text as much as you can. So, like, integrate some quotes, do some textual analysis in your reading. Like, so, talk about things that interest you for sure, but throw some quotes in to kind of ground your analysis in the text. Okay, so I'm noticing so far you guys are throwing some good thoughts in there, but you're not really quoting the text. try to throw some quotes in for the one that you do next week. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay, good. Yeah, look, you can't analyze literature without analyzing the text, right? So, well, you guys all have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys again next week.
Have a good day.
Okay.
Thank you.